Hello, everybody, and welcome to this session of the conference on real estate perspectives. Uh, my name is Peter Ayres. I'm the Chief Executive of the Churches Conservation Trust in England, and we have some great speakers for you in this session. Can I remind you, in the bottom of your screen, you have the option to have a translation service, because this will be a multilingual process session between English and German. So please bear that in mind. The two people, apart from myself, we have today means that we've got a really interesting perspective on real estate. I think it's sort of stretching a point with me. I work for a charity, as you'll see, and we look after historic church buildings, and we find ways to make them sustainable. But we also have a bona fide property developer who owns a business, Mickey BOSSCHERT, who has a fantastic called Reliplan, which has been in existence since 1991, and looks at supporting the sale and development of places of worship. And we also have Professor Dr. ULRICH BOGENSTÄTTER, I'm trying to pronounce his name correctly, from the University of Mainz, who has an academic view as a professor of technical building management, and a very good collection of selected projects such as church real estate management, which seems distinctly apt for this session, as well as Evangelical Real Estate Association in Germany, multimedia church and real estate management successful portfolio holders. So I think we should be able to give you a very interesting set of perspectives about buildings and their development. So what I will do now is I will share my screen and move on to my presentation. So the Churches Conservation Trust was formed in 1969 as a genuine partnership between church and state to deal with the growing numbers of very historic churches which no longer had a viable congregation for them. And as you can see, we were called originally the Redundant Churches Fund. We only changed our name later on. Although this wasn't one of our buildings, I hasten to add, this is a dramatic photograph to encapsulate the spirit of what was happening to religious buildings in this time of the 1960s, 70s, where a lot of buildings were seen to stand in the way of progress, and there was a potential that there was a great deal of loss going to be had to this collection of buildings across England. This was the first church we took on, St. Peter's Church in Edlington in South Yorkshire. It's a fantastic building with, as you can see, a great deal of Romanesque architecture. The photograph at the top is not how it looks now, but it had no roof. As you can see, this building was left for ruin, a 12th century building left and abandoned, and you can see why there was a need for a church's conservation trust. By 1976, we had 100 churches, and this one is pretty apt to show you, because we're just about to start a very big project to really bring this building back into the heart of the community. As you can see, it stands in the heart of the marketplace in Sudbury. 1992, we changed our name from the Redundant Churches Fund to the Churches Conservation Trust to really describe the evolving nature of our work. Now, at this point, up to this point, we really were a conservation charity, and what we did was we repaired buildings, and if you were very lucky, we would open the doors to let you have a look, but not much else happened. But early this century, in the year 2000, we acquired this building in Bristol, in an area called St. Paul's, which had suffered a lot from civil unrest. And in 2005, we created a circus school from this particular building, which you can see here, which was a hugely innovative project. We restored this fantastic 19th century church interior and hung a frame underneath the ceiling, where you can today learn really important circus skills. And I have, in fact, learned to trapeze upside down in this building. And if you're very excited, I'll share the film of me doing so because I thought it was an important statement to make. Here you can see the interior. This was a £2.5 million project with the support of the National Lottery Heritage Fund in England, and it still exists today. It's still operating, and the people who learn their circus skills here go into places like Cirque du Soleil in the end. Now, it took us about 10 years to come round to this building here, which is All Souls in Bolton. Now, there was over £1 million worth of repair needed for this building, and the church had very few visitors. When I first visited in 2007, there was in the book, it was recorded that there'd been one visitor. Now, this building is in the heart of a predominantly Muslim community, and there are 3 mosques within a 250-meter radius of the building. But it was working with that Muslim community that inspired us to get involved and do something about this, to bring the building back into the community. Literally all souls for all souls, because all the good quality space was owned by the mosques, and there wasn't anywhere that was a space for the whole of the community. It's been a great success, It's been a difficult project, but there are offices for hire and a community and conference space along with a community cafe. Here's the interior before the alteration. It's the largest uninterrupted span of any parish church in the country and had seating for 800 people. Here it is fully repaired and welcoming, and a confident 21st century design so that the building could be used practically and generate an income to support the long-term future. What's important about this is it's a very high quality piece of design that was placed in one of the poorest communities in the country. And I think that was important that we had that. And as you can see, there are the pods inside that vast space. Here's St. Nicholas Chapel in King's Lynn, a 15th century church, one of the largest, well, the largest chapel of ease in the country, a fantastic thing, all part of the trade that went on in King's Lynn. The Hanseatic League are very involved in this building, which was very, very important. And we basically improved the facilities here so that it could be used as a community-based venue suitable for dinners. You see the toilets, obviously very important. And we also put solar panels on the roof to keep the costs running down. Now, one of the biggest problems for our dealing with buildings is that if we install services such as electricity and lighting, is the cost of a utility is a huge issue for the ongoing running costs of the building. I'm going to move a bit quicker. This is St Mary at Quay in Ipswich. Again, this needed a lot of repair because the Victorians had put a concrete floor in the building and it was literally crumbling to dust. But here we redeveloped the building to create multifunctional usage. We built an extension to the building and the best internal conference space in Ipswich today. Definitely an asset from what was a liability. Now, here we have 2 more on site at the moment, 2 more projects on site, one in Worcester, one in Sunderland, which have been delayed through COVID pandemic, but we will have them open, we hope, by the end of the year, beginning of next year. But here's also a picture of a staircase we built in a medieval tower in Kent, in St Peter's Sandwich, so that you can look to France, and we had paying visitors come through. We also created a champing, which is a tourism product, which you may well have heard of, which is church camping, which is open, champing.co.uk, which allows the usage of church buildings across the country for tourism. So you can stay overnight in these wonderful buildings and perfect for social distancing and getting away from it all. And certainly with tourism this year, be important to do. But what I really wanted to talk to you about was the Old Black Lion pub, because this is a place where we are looking at taking on the development of a public house next door to one of our churches. And the reason that's very important is because we think the long-term sustainability of the building next door, which is this on the right-hand side, which is this Norman church, so 12th century church, its future is actually dependent on that pub there, because we can make this church building sustainable if we create a sustainable business next door. The church building is a very, very precious building, and it would be very difficult to insert toilets and the facilities needed to create an event space. But if we have the pub next door, which you can see the context of them there, they're right next to each other, we can actually bring the services there and make the pub building be part of the church building, and they can work in harmony. And we fully intend to make a surplus from the hospitality business, which will help support the long ongoing ongoing running of the church building. So obviously when we open the pub, we'll be selling great food and beer. So as soon as we have such a good European audience, if you have recommendations for the beer we should be stocking in the pub when we open it, please do put those down as well. Now, this has been a long-term 5-year strategy of trying to put this project together, because it's very difficult. There was not a very helpful owner of the pub building. The local government has now bought the pub, and we're just negotiating the lease now. But it will mean that we are able to use this building again. Again, it sits in an area of quite high deprivation in this area, and it needs quite a lot of work. But here's the pub elevation. You can see right next to the churchyard, and you can see the relationship here. Now, interestingly, if you look to if I try and move my cursor here, this is Northampton Railway Station, which is important for this conference, because this is where I first took a phone call from Kirsten when we were talking about this conference. So it's just that close, this conference, to this project. As you can see, the infrastructure around it is quite useful, and it provides a prominent location. Also down here is actually the remains of Northampton Castle, which was a very prominent Norman castle. And in fact, Thomas Becket, or St. Thomas Becket, fled to France from this castle when the king was about to put him on trial. So it's a hugely historic area, but we think that the combination of the pub and the church together could be very good. Now, I wanted to show you the interior of the church. It has these incredible Romanesque carvings in the building, not a single religious icon in there. They are all very much non-religious, the iconography in the building. And the picture on the right hand side is of the interior before there was a reordering by the Victorians, but it shows what a beautiful open space it was. Now it's very different. As you can see, it's filled with pews, and there are different levels in the building as well. But we hope to be able to use the building for events, which will also help in turn to provide income for the long-term sustainability of the building. Here again, you can see how we plan the relationship between the pub and the church. There's steps up to the churchyard from the pub here, and then there'll be services to enable the church and the pub to work together in beautiful harmony. Now, this is actually the 5-year strategy of the Church's Conservation Trust, and rather than write a lengthy document, we thought we would draw a picture of it. And I hope this makes clear, but what's at the heart of this is actually to support communities to use and love their historic places of worship. And that means for a wide variety of uses. It's really important to engage people at every level. In some cases, obviously, there'll be people who can use this continuing for religious usage, but actually the idea is that there's such a wide variety of uses, because these buildings are actually the most important and most democratic of historic buildings in England. The parish church tells a story of the place that it is in, unlike any other building, and they belong to absolutely everybody. And we want to find a way to support communities to keep that ownership rather than them going anywhere else. We also have a a consultancy service which looks at how we can support other places, make alterations to historic places of worship. We have a maintenance business where we can support other places of worship maintain their buildings. We have champing. We undertake filming in our sites as well. And also, we are very keen on the promotion of the shared cultural value of these historic places of worship. And we are very, very keen that these buildings are, that society understands the value of these buildings, because religion is quite divisive and people don't want to come. We feel we have to explain why these buildings are exciting. And during all the lockdowns that we've had in England, we started a free online lecture series on Thursday lunchtimes at 1 o'clock, which you'll all be invited to join via Facebook. You're all welcome to come to help explain why these buildings are fantastic and useful to everybody. Now, I don't want to go on, but we're always looking for creative reuses of buildings, but actually one of the biggest problems is actually finding what we call the conservation deficit. So the difference between what it would normally take to convert a building to another use and the cost of doing this in one of the most highly listed buildings in the country. This is always fine, and we've been very grateful to have the support of the National Lottery Heritage Fund in England, which does support these projects and helps them go on. But it's a very difficult question as to where you find the capital to invest in some of these buildings where there isn't a straightforward investment plan. And there we go. That's the end of my presentation. So let me now hand over to Mickey BOSSCHERT of Reliplan in the Netherlands. I'm very pleased to, I've just had a look at their amazing website where they do offer a very comprehensive service for dealing with historic churches in the Netherlands. So Mickey, over to you.
Okay, I'm speaking from Belgium. I gave over the project in the Netherlands to younger people, and I have a lot of experience with the reuse of churches, 25 years experience, and I have been dealing with church reuse for 30 years actually. This is, we are now called differently. It still exists, but because we reused a lot of buildings, I chose Heritage Europe, and because we also work in Belgium and France. Why did I start? Because a lot of church buildings were demolished in the Netherlands. This is, for example, the Willy Brothers Church in Amsterdam. It was a wonderful church and they just demolished it. And they said, well, we don't have any money and maintenance costs too much. And so I was so shocked. I didn't start in real estate. I was 41 years old and I noticed that so many church buildings are demolished. And real estate developers did not even care. It was too expensive and too complicated. And so I started to take that on. So the spectrum, the range of reuses, we can see how many there are. My husband said at the time, you have to know in Holland how many churches there are. And there are many, many. This morning I heard the numbers and I thought, well, but there are so many more. I'm sorry to say that, but we did a stock taking a few years ago, and the most important for reuse is to have an overview. Who is interested in these churches? Who has the money? Who can use these church buildings? So that is what we started with. A big stock taking of interested parties in these churches. And then you can offer good consultation for the parish. I find it very uncomfortable to have a supermarket in a church. I wouldn't do that because you have other possibilities. And this is also true for some denominations. This was this church I mentioned. Now we have this building here. You can see that it is really unfortunate. Could you show the next slide? Okay. In the 80s in Amsterdam, from the 70s to the 90s, 25 big churches were demolished only in Amsterdam. So that was catastrophic. This is a church I knew well as well. The next page, please. It also shows the demolition of these churches. So, next page. This is the monastery, and then that is what I started with because it was supposed to be demolished and it wasn't a listed monument. And the developer who bought it said, I will turn it into a shopping center. And it was a big surface with houses, a school building, and the monastery. And he had difficulties to develop that. And because they had so many interested parties, they talked to each other, and then he said, well, let's take a look. And so I went there and I saw the cloister, and I said, oh, it's so beautiful. And I said, why should we demolish that? And I said, and he said, what other possibility do we have? And I said, well, if you sell it now in the state it is in, what is the price then? And he said, well, I have to have 5 million. And so I took the decision to buy it. And he said, why? And I said, okay, please sign here, I will buy it. You can see here it is a big plot, 10,000 square meters, a big surface. And because I had so many applications, I went to the bank. So this was at the beginning of the 90s. And all the financial experts said, what do you want with a church? But I said, I urgently need these 5 million and a little bit more. Because of course you have maintenance, etc. And I had a different company and I didn't have enough money. And the bank said, Mrs. BOSSCHERT, if you have rental contracts, not one, but several rental agreements, then you can come back. And so that is the most important thing, which I want to say in this speech. I had so many applications. And so I found a church chapel. I found something for the city of Amsterdam, for the Salvation Army, and also a civic association. And this is the school to the left. which also contributed. And then the civic association rented something. And it was developed into 10 apartments. And this whole process took less than 6 months. Not, of course, the development of the apartments, but the rental agreements, the funding. And it was a very good project, and I learned a lot. I will give you an example. This church was then sold to a developer, and 2 years ago, this church was sold for 9.2 million euros and was redeveloped again for 50 million euros and is now a hotel. So for the process, it was also important that I posed the question. So many questions that I was able to do this redevelopment rather quickly. So what is Reliplan? Reliplan is a platform of 25 architects and specialists, lawyers, urbanists, etc. And for example, the architects, they contributed something every year. And we have franchise holders who paid a certain price for the platform. And so you have the expertise available and you can work rather quickly. I just heard that architects are contribute afterwards. This is not how we worked. In a small parish, for example, we did a lot of information and consultation. For example, I went to the bakery. I asked the people who work there, what is happening in the village? What do we have here? What do you need? And after a few hours, I knew what is available there. Is there a kindergarten? Is something different? And then I went to the church council and I asked, what are your wishes? What do you want? And that, together with this big consultation, we had 3,000 or 4,000 questions, inquiries of buyers or interested parties.
Where we stopped. Okay. So we did the same thing in Belgium. We also bought an abbey, a monastery. We were asked to do that. And I was about to explain that we usually work in this way. We get information in the village or in the city what we need at the location. And then there are wishes from the church. It's important what the church wants. What do they want? What is their goal? A church and an abbey, that's always connected with emotion. And then you take that together. And the question that we have, then we also have the architects right from the start. And we have to know where the money comes from. Of course, this has to be paid. You cannot keep thousands of churches if nobody pays for that. So the architect makes a plan, then the value of the church increases, and we submit this plan to the owners. And then actually you can act quite quickly, because you don't need a year-long process of talks. You really have to be quite quick and just follow through with the process. So in Belgium, this was a bit different. This was in the Ardennes, and the people asked us, okay, what can we do? And we said, well, we in this region, the only thing we can do is to have holiday apartments, and that's what we did. Next slide, please. So what are the users? So there are civil society organizations. This can be, for example, the Salvation Army, can be kindergarten, it can be a yoga center, it can be a library, and there are various purposes. Okay, maybe we can have the other slide with the church congregations. Please go back in the presentation. Can we have the other slide, please? No, that's the wrong one. Okay, so this is the owners. Oh no, well, do you want me to go forwards or backwards in the presentation? Do you go further back? Yes, exactly. This is the slide I needed. So this is congregations, organizations of civil society, cultural organizations, companies, investors, can also be foundations. And this is just a small part of the types of congregations we have in the Netherlands. We have more than 120 different churches, denominations. And I said that to Mr. Sonneberg last week. There is more than 80 various congregations just in Northern Holland. And they have all these buildings. And if you want to sell such a building, first of all, you need to ask yourself, can it be used by another church, maybe by another congregation, by another denomination? And of course, there are great differences between the churches, but after a while, you know how one denomination sees it and how another one may see it. And you also have an idea of the budget that you need. Last week, we talked about a church that was to be sold, and I tried to give some consulting services to them. And this was, for example, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and they looked for a church. And then somebody told me, yes, but they don't have the money for this price for this church. Then I said, well, you can also, you know, take up a loan, go to a bank. And then that's also what we did. Reliplan, we sold, we bought churches and rented and sold them and leased them. And, you know, that's all things that you can do to enable such processes.
Sorry to interrupt, but you have one minute left.
This is the Herrenhausen congregation, and this they have bought a project from the Reformed Church. Next, please. So as I said before, this is our working method, that you combine the expertise of various people, and you need that to include this in the process. And then there will be a lot of questions. But if you have all that, you can act quite quickly. In Netherlands and in Belgium, we have dealt with nearly 1,000 church buildings together in the two countries. So we work together in the two countries, in Belgium and in the Netherlands. Again, the next slide, please. Yes, we already had that. Next, please. Again, I already mentioned the Civil Society Association. And it's really quite diverse. And this is the lady from the Salvation Army. The Salvation Army is a great partner. We work a lot with them. And so from 400 properties, there are a lot of churches, and they are quite active with us. And they're also rented buildings. So if you really work together on a good perspective and a good level, then a lot of things are possible. These are the cultural organizations, museums, music, theater, photo galleries. And next slide, please. These are some examples. The Bethlehem Church in Amsterdam. This is a church which has been sold by a Pentecostal church that didn't have enough money. So we also offered them a financing because the banks didn't do anything at the time, and we did that. And we suggest help also with the funding. Next slide, please.
I'm sorry, we're just about out of time now, if that's okay.
This is Reflit. This is a church. And we have a catering. And there's more catering. And we have that you can book. And when the first person booked, then more people will follow. But every month we had a contract with the church, and we had the money to do that and to use the church. Next slide, please. This is the Ritterkerk Church in Amsterdam, and now it has been sold to a hotel. And then there is another example where this is now an office for lawyers. And these are further examples in Belgium for private apartments where people now live in the former church building. So we as Reliplan, we do not develop any apartments. That's not what we do. But we handed this over to other developers because it takes longer, and we just specialized on other things. We concentrate on civil society organizations. Next, please. So what's important, and this is something I haven't heard before, is to have an overview of the buyer and of the person doing it. It's always, it's companies that buy things in the Netherlands. It's in Belgium, somebody who wanted to invest in church buildings, and they had 50 millions in order to buy the churches, but of course you also need to have people who use it.
Okay, I think we're out of time now, I'm afraid to say. Is there a summing up you want to do before we stop?
Okay, the last page, please. Last one. Yes, this is something I developed myself. This is also for church buildings, an idea that you can have a website, and maybe for one day or so you can just lease this building for some kind of events after Corona. We can, maybe have a wedding or something. So that's also possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mickey. Thank you very much for that. And sorry about the technical issues that you experienced during. Okay, thank you. Let's move on then swiftly to ULRICH BOGENSTÄTTER to give us more of a academic point of view after we've had the charity and we've had the real estate developer. ULRICH, over to you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can all hear me. I have the pleasure of talking about 10 years of real estate development in the church. I will try to do this in 15 minutes, which will be exciting. At first, I want to look beyond our noses in 4 points. In real estate management is present in this title. What were the topics of real estate management in the last 20 years? And then these particularities of real estate management in the church. And then to talk about what has been indirectly addressed in many speeches, money. How to calculate the costs and maybe include that in a portfolio, which maybe as a contribution to the discussion, what do we need from my perspective for the churches? If you take a look at real estate management, then a lot of sectors have developed, like corporate real estate management or a new attempt, ecclesiastic real estate management, especially for the ecclesiastical sector, or public real estate management for public real estate and welfare real estate management, which can also concern church institutions or hospitals. But what they all have in common maybe are these 4 points below. Professionalization. So we have a real estate, which can be seen as a part of the value chain. So it is not just located in its environment, it also has a contribution. What has been taking place more and more in the last 20 years are the life cycle costs, which are now in focus. So the real estate can increase its costs. It can become more expensive. So the decision about what to do with real estate, you have to consider all of these life cycle costs, and you have to know them. What is also being discussed is the topic of sustainability in some form, green buildings, maybe a keyword, or sustainability. And something that has also been the focus of more attention, especially thinking about the carbon dioxide footprint, digitization, which we talk about more and more now during the pandemic. So if we talk about professionalization, we want to know our buildings more and more. We want to know how the costs over a lifespan of 100 or 200 years, or maybe focusing on 50 years or 25 years, we want to know these costs, because we know that these subsequent costs can be considerable. So for churches, maintenance, of course, you cannot ignore that. And if I think if I think ahead a lot, then I can also economize. This slide is relatively old. Then sustainability, there are a lot of certificates, BREEAM, Green Star, LEED, etc. They play more and more important roles to define what is a good real estate project. Sustainability has a lot of dimensions, not only ecological, economic, but also a socio-cultural perspective. So church buildings can also be a part of that. Digitization has also not been mentioned that often, because if we professionalize certain sectors, we need, of course, the IT tools. Here I showed you a catastrophic slide of all the tools which are present in the real estate sector. You can see special fields, especially for church real estate management. But what does real estate management, what is special about it when talking about churches? As an architect, I would say, well, they are buildings And we have relatively simple special uses, which we can talk about more, of course, but also profitability, economic efficiency. If we think about the location, we need to talk about profitability, about the costs, also maybe the topic of carbon dioxide footprint in the sense of a green church. I haven't heard about that today or yesterday. So these ecological aspects. Ultimately, we talked a lot about these options, what I can do with churches. I can decommission them. I know a representative of a church who said, well, we won't have any money, we will just close it and we can open it in 10 years. So decommissioning was one option, which was at least discussed. In fact, church real estate management is difficult because it has a lot of facets. In a portfolio of real estate management, there are churches who fulfill their church use. And then we also have fiscal assets, which may include the parsonage, for example. And then we have properties which are maybe investments by the church. So all of this can be part of church real estate. And then the focus, of course, differs. The churches are part of these real estate properties, which are part of the church mission. So we are not talking just about churches, but also about when we talk about parishes, we talk about different buildings, because the state church of Hanover, for example, also possesses annexes, parish halls, parsonages, etc. So if we talk about a parish, we are talking about a whole portfolio of buildings, of different buildings. What is special about churches is also the fact that these decisions are made differently, because the owner is the church and the pyramid of decisions is inversed. So we have the parish at the top, which is different from a company, for example. So it's complicated. Cost allocation is also difficult because different investors, sponsors, foundations may be contributing to one building. But churches have to recalculate. You have to look for alternatives because you simply lack the money. Here in the Diocese of Mainz, we can see that because we're talking about the mergers of parishes. The topic of sustainability is also has been discussed for a long time. Or what I also mentioned with LEED or BREEAM, there are certificates like the Grüner Gockel, a green rooster, if you will. So this topic has arrived at the churches, and there are a lot of options to deal with that. We've heard a lot about it as a cultural church, as a reuse, or a cultural church, a columbarium, a library, or with a salutation towards London, a sports hall, or residential buildings or apartments. But the question is, don't we want to connect the congregation members with the church? So we're talking about the buildings, but we're also talking about the congregation, of course. And basically, if I say, I would say that the young church members should also find their place. And I translated this to digitization 4.0. We should have solutions for a parish church 4.0. There was a pilot project to actually bring people back to church, the Nichols School and an evangelical church as well. I just show this image. Is this attractive for members of the congregation to increase its use? We would talk about normally about occupancy or vacancy, our buildings are sustainable if they are truly used. This project, of course, focused on how to digitize this. We want to open churches, we want to make them accessible. We maybe want to reach the youth as well with a multimedia parish church. This was a project presented in Berlin, and you can see with very simple means, this was received very well. USB connections, outlets, so just to recharge your phone, for example. So how do I get people to come to church? Ultimately, the question which moves us is what value do we ascribe to churches? And Mickey already said, we are talking about valuation, of course. It is difficult to determine the earnings value of a church. Basically, we're talking about a substantial value, a real valuation, which should also, of course, include discounting and cash value reflections. Comparative value is difficult. I think the examples we saw do not really consider all the costs. So what can a church cost? What is it allowed to cost? And that is why I want to ask provocatively, or show you provocatively, what we're discussing here in the public agencies. And these public services also have the same questions, because of course the real value is important. You can't just determine a rental price. So here's a report about the operation costs. What do these buildings cost? What will they cost over the next 50 years? And you can see it very provocatively. For the Day of German Reunification, we published this. What does my house really cost? Not only investment costs, but also the entire lifespan. We had this as an Excel solution, and you could see how the costs over the next 50 years developed. We followed up on this, and we have now created a data bank solution, and we found interested parties in the respective energy agencies, because we include which structural components are included. Is it floor heating? What material do we have? It may sound very complicated, which is why I propose to provocatively calculate it in 10 minutes, because it is a lot to include. And we wanted to develop a tool to calculate it very quickly, to have some numbers which can then be included into the planning process and then be adapted. So we're talking about investment costs, financing costs, ecological costs, replacement dates, for example, for the church ceiling, annual costs like heating, additional charges through photovoltaic systems, for example. Are we constructing something? Are we selling something? Are we renting something? Then we have a portfolio which a church parish can have, which is why I want to reminisce about an old advert. You just need 3 things, without talking about smokers, but there was this old advert. You need a Stanwell, a cigar, a pipe, and a smoker. So what do I have to know? What type of building do I need? I'm sorry, it's very, he speaks very quickly. It's just not possible to keep up. But you can also include this in a database. You have to know the surface. We have a very simple volume, and to have the first numbers there, you have to know how long you want to use it, the lifespan, and then decide if you can demolish, or if you have this modular design in very simple steps. And a church from the 60s, of course, is different than a modern church or a church from 200 years ago.
So we are looking at this on the level of components components, and then you can ask the question, what is the ecological balance? So what about the CO2 footprint? I have an example. For example, we have a time frame of 50 years, and we look at the time when some components need to be replaced, and this is accumulated. Here's another view. How can we use this in order to maybe look at competitors as a comparison over various years? So we are able to calculate various possibilities with the same project, have several possibilities, and then can calculate what this will mean for the environment, how much CO2 will be emitted, what is the CO2 footprint. And if I take this seriously, I can really calculate the consequences for the ecology, and I can also see the costs of this. And this is kind of the headline for the whole portfolio. You can maybe have a better basis for your decision if I can be very strategic based on my calculations. So the alarm clock has already rung. I'm sorry, but I have really reached my last overview. So basically, I believe that church real estate management will become more professional in the future, and that we need instruments in order to do that, in order to be able to make good decisions what to do with it, what the consequences are. The quality will increase with more data and networking of data. And I don't think you can leave the congregations alone with that decision, but they need some kind of authority or advice in order to be able to do all these calculations. So just in one example, we need strategies. And this is the Evangelical Church in Baden. They offer their congregations, their parishes, well, they give them suggestions how you can do this process, and also regarding the life cycle. So I hope this was interesting for you. This was very brief, this overview. This was about 10 years of real estate management in the church development, but also an outlook into the future, where we can go into the future. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you very much, Ulrich. That was a lot of information very quickly given. So thank you. If you could stop sharing. Thank you. Thank you for that. Three very different perspectives on the issues of real estate. So I was trying to find a way to bring them all together, really. And there were sort of three things that I thought I would pick out. The first one, which we can't not talk about, is money. And money is very important. And I think that there are sources of investment, and there are needs for those money. So you've got the long-term life cycle of the building, which is what Ulrich was talking about. You've got the property investment, which is what Mickey was talking about, and I was talking about the what we describe in England as the conservation deficit, the cost between the economic redevelopment of a historic building and actually what a new build would cost to deal with. And as there's a difference in the price there. And I suppose to the panel, really, you must have come across this issue of how do you find the subsidy necessary to develop and maintain these buildings, and do you feel that there is a need for the state to invest to make sure that we can keep the iconic buildings, but at the same time make sure that they are actually manageable in the long term? I hope that was a clear question. So we'll start with Mickey. I'd be interested in your view on subsidy as a property developer.
Because you cannot deduct the VAT with the civil society association. So if you have other costs and the VAT, then you can't do that. This is something you need to take into account. You can do this with commercial buildings, but not with the civil society associations in the Netherlands. So the VAT is always an issue.
That's very interesting. VAT is a big issue in England as well regarding historic buildings, in that it is chargeable on those. Ulrich, do you have a view on the state investment required on buildings?
Yes, I think we would need to see it in a European comparison, how to finance it. We have public support, we have subsidies for some measures, for example, for energy, but I think the most money will come from via a levy from the federal churches, or maybe also via the taxes, the church tax that is levied. So the interesting question is, how do we control the money that we have? I mean, how do we use this money in a purposeful way? One discussion is with this levy, with this tax for the maintenance. Is the focus more on the maintenance of buildings, or do you want to have a lively congregation? So if I have many people in the congregation who do a lot, maybe they would get more money than a parish that is kind of half dead, so have no more members. So I think the battle is a bit between who will receive the subsidies for what, and maybe between the different dioceses. But this may be different in other European countries, especially maybe in London. Maybe they need to finance in a different way. I think in Germany this works differently, and this is why I believe we need to talk about subsidy programs. There are different payers that may be relevant, but basically it's a question to the dioceses and to the state churches, and also the question to the society: what do we want to pay for that?
Absolutely, it is a question of what do we value and how do we value it. It's not all about, do you have to put a monetary value on all of those elements as well. The other theme I wanted to just pull out as well was this issue of consultation and communities. I think all three speakers identified that these buildings are of value to society, and there are communities of people around them. What I was struck by was Nikki's approach to community consultation, which I thought was brilliant, to go to the bakery and see what local people wanted from the building, which I thought was really good. And that was a good description.
But also what this congregation needs, or maybe what's missing in this village.
Yeah.
This is interesting.
Yeah, I thought it was very good, because we at the Church's Conservation Trust have developed quite a process to consult with the community and see it as a very solid first platform to when we begin looking at a church. So before we do anything, we have a look at the community. What's the makeup of that community? What services do they already have? And what is potentially missing, which is effectively what I understood. That's kind of what you were doing as well. And we take that process through. Then once we've identified where the needs are, it gives you some ideas about how you might be wanting to use the building that you have in your care, so that you're not competing with other services, but you're actually providing something of value to that local community. I thought that was an interesting parallel with what you do. But you're also looking for a long-term sustainable investment, not necessarily a community-based one. Is that correct?
Well, it takes some time, this whole counseling process. We didn't have any competitors in that process for a while, so you have to be creative and seek possibilities in order to do this quickly and correctly. And I still believe, and I think yesterday somebody mentioned this, I think it was Heidi Weinberg. She was a project manager, and I hope that what we did in the Netherlands, well, I think this can also be done in Germany. There was somebody who knows the technique of just, follow this process and work together with the church, that this works. I think you can apply this. And there is so much difference between the architects. One architecture has to have this, and another architecture has to have that. So you need specialists because they're all different.
Yeah, ULRICH wants to come in, I think.
Maybe you need to begin one step before, because project development is something, but you need to decide whether you want to sell the church or have a new use. But in my world, first you have a congregation and you first need a plan before you make any kind of decision. In the commercial field, you would need a business plan about the development in the next 5 or 10 years. What will be the development of the members, the church members? What's going to be the financial development? They are not just church buildings, but maybe also kindergartens or maybe vicarages, parsonages, and you need to be included. And maybe you can say, okay, we keep the church, but we give up the parsonage. So this is why you have to look at a portfolio. Where do I want to go? And before you really sell a church as an owner, because the churches are usually the owners, you need some kind of strategic plan where you want to go and where do you want to go? What is our aim? What's the direction to take? So I believe we don't have to be just sustainable, meaning in the long run, but I think we should really continue this thought into the future, and we need the instruments to do that in order to see what will be in 10 years' time. Yes, but you don't know what we all have. I mean, in 10 years' time, so many things can change. You see it now, the real estate situation. These investors have retail and offices. They have invested, and well, things keep changing the whole life. After the COVID pandemic, things will be different again. And in France, things have already changed. They don't have any more shops in the villages, and you don't know what will happen in 10 years' time. Let me tell you something else. So there's always the question, what will happen? And we even have bought some churches, and then now the congregation is renting it back, this building. And now the same congregation asked us, oh, they will want to buy it back actually from us. So there's always constant change, constant development. Things may be different in a couple of years. And maybe other churches will do that too.
I would agree with the idea that change is necessary. The project we did in Ipswich, St Mary at Key, was a project partnership with a mental health charity, which we developed over a long period of time. COVID comes along and the charity decides that this building isn't the building for them to take on. And actually, we're now negotiating with it becoming a church again, which is for us kind of a strange, that's amazing, very good, but because we've undertaken the work in the building, we've created a space which is now got modern services in it, and it's very flexible and is of very high quality. So we're quite confident that although it's not fulfilling its original purpose, that there is a useful function for that building into the future. The last thing I wanted to sort of draw us together on, which I think I'm going to try and conflate two things together, if that's okay, because I think they're both quite important, was the issue of sustainability, from not only from the long-term management of the building, but also from the green agenda, from the climate change issue for buildings. And I was going to try and sneak in also, it's not really related, but the change in society due to the fact that we now exist on Zoom rather than in reality, and what impact that has on buildings as well, and what the potential impact is there. But just the first issue on sustainability, I'm very interested in the potential embedded carbon in a lot of these ancient buildings in the first place, and how do we use them effectively to offset, because it's obviously going to be more damaging to demolish and rebuild something than it is to deal with a building which has been there for centuries. I don't know if ULRICH, you want to reflect on that issue first. Yep, ULRICH.
I would start with a simple theory. existing buildings should, according to the theory, become more valuable because they did already exist as gray energy. I assume, I have to verify, but I assume that some state governments are thinking about implementing a carbon dioxide cost or tax, which will then, of course, make new buildings more expensive. So then we would have, then the existing buildings would have to become more valuable because if we build something comparable, it will be more expensive. So that would be my theory, that existing buildings become more valuable. Under the aspect of this ecological balance, it would be helpful to reuse existing buildings or use them more intensely. Sorry, to give them a longer life.
Mickey.
I thought that was very interesting. Or is it a question for me?
Well, I just wondered if you wanted to reflect on the issue of carbon footprint and climate change on buildings and the importance of reusing buildings rather than building new ones.
Well, it will become more difficult for some buildings. We have some monastery still. You have to change so much because of energy consumption, gas, etc. in the Netherlands. So it will be a challenge, yes.
Yeah, thank you. And if you look in the chat, my colleague from the Church of England, Joe Elders, has just put up how the Church of England are thinking about climate change and their goals to deal with sustainability. It's worth a look. It's a really interesting piece of work as well. I think we need to take some questions from the floor, but before I do that, I'd just like to thank all of the audience for your beer suggestions for the pub. Do keep those coming in as we go through. But I think, Kirsten, did you want to pick out some questions for us from the chat?
So the chat is becoming more animated. I am already sorry because we will not be able to address everything. One question in the beginning to Peter. How do you fund your projects and who then manages the pub? So the financial framework of the projects which we've seen, that is the first question.
Okay,
I will do them successively.
Okay, the charity itself is funded partly by the government, partly by the Church of England, and then we double that money by commercial activity and fundraising. And for a project like the pub, we have been funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, the local authority, and we've also raised some money from other places in order to invest. The pub itself will be owned by local government. We will have a lease, so we will rent the building, and we will have a managing operator in the building who works with us to make sure, because we know many things, but we don't know how to run pubs, I don't think.
Okay. During the last discussion, this was forgotten a little bit. We have the information about FRH, the future religious heritage, the fact that you play an important role, Peter, and it was there was an intense collaboration with them. Let us, so in the chat, let us empower the voice that says that it's important to discuss the future of religious heritage on European level through collaboration, through cooperation. There is a lot of knowledge to share and to build on it together. This is just a small part of this discussion. I summarized it. And in this context, I want to also explain that we will have the possibility in the discussion rooms to go deeper into these topics. Another very intense discussion developed in the chat around the question of mosques. Is it admissible, is it permissible that a church be turned into a mosque? what different arguments are there. Birgit Meyer is doing research on this topic and says that as a scientist, she would like to continue this, to follow up on that. She doesn't see it from the perspective of policy, but she's doing research on it. And there were a lot of discussion points around that. Several times people referenced the presentation of Anna Kleurs, one of the grantee presentations. The Fatih Mosque in Amsterdam was referenced, where there are research projects around that. So that is also a discussion point where I can imagine that maybe we can talk about this afternoon as well. In my presentation, I also said I wouldn't do it. I also have this experience. Another question or information in the posts are about green churches. There was a short discussion around the question that there's not only church reuse or demolition, there's also new buildings, new church buildings that are being constructed. But it does not result in a question. One moment, please. And then details like the question of value-added tax, subsidy programs. Kerstin Menzel says, for a long-term planning in rural areas, it would be very difficult that we have no real clarity around the grants programs or subsidy programs. It's very difficult to turn it into questions because it's.
I think that's quite an interesting point there, actually. And if it's okay, I'd just like to address that from an English perspective, because in the countryside in England are something like the vast majority of the most important historic buildings are there. And the Church of England owns 45% of the highest listed buildings in the country. I think something like 75% of them are in the countryside or something like that, where there's the least population of the country. I do think that communities, small communities, can find a way to maintain these buildings, as in the annual cyclical repair, annual cyclical maintenance. But when it comes to the lifespan of these buildings, you're talking hundreds of years. Every 50 years or so, you need to invest a lot of money to protect the building. And I don't believe small communities on their own can do that. And that's why I think there needs to be some level of intervention to provide funding for those once in a generation repairs. Because I think if that's there and that's the safety net, then there's also the opportunity for the communities to concentrate on good maintenance, because it will mean that the whole system is more efficient.
I would like to support that, because I think one big question is how, if we want to preserve our buildings, our churches, this maintenance and life cycle span, it's not energy consumption, but the roof, the doors, the windows, etc. So to preserve these aspects, and I think for that you need a plan, you need an idea. Nothing is better than a plan, but without a plan, it becomes more difficult. So you need. I believe in plans, economic plans, financial plans. The coronavirus pandemic has changed everything, it's true, but you need a plan. How to, over a long-term period, a keyword by Peter, not only the running costs, but also the fact that these buildings should not be allowed to fall into disrepair. But if you use them and you have the money, that is everything, right? Who has the money? If the church is used partially, then you have the money. That is our experience. In a monastery, which is also a monument, you can operate it. I think before that, the congregation, the parish has to make a decision whether it wants to preserve the buildings or not, or keep the buildings or not. I'm a step further away, basically, that the parish has to develop a plan whether to keep the buildings, whether to get rid of them. So I'm just one step before you, basically. But we agree, I think.
I was going to say that I think this is a question for society. It's not just a parish or the owner. These are significant historic value. Then they need to be considered very carefully. Who actually supports the long-term management and maintenance of the building? But before I go, can I just thank Mickey and ULRICH, who were fantastic. Thank you for that. And thank you for all of you joining in. And don't forget to give me good advice on beers. Okay, thank you.